Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And we are really blessed to have Joseph P. Farrell with us tonight. And you can email Joseph at Vardas, V as in Victor, ARDAS 3, the number 3, at AOL.com. And Joseph has a website, GizaDeathStar.com. And on that website, there is a PayPal button. Please make use of it so we can keep him in research materials. Tonight, we're going to talk about Joseph's latest book. Yeah. Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. And Joseph, this is a book that has needed to be written.
Well, I hope so. It's a book that before I even get started on that, I do want to say thank you, a deep thank you to all the people that have been signing up on the website and making donations, and in particular to one dear lady that has done so much. I want to thank especially her because she knows who she is, but it's been a lot of work, and as you know, and I'm just and I'm writing 3 books at the same time right now, and
yes.
And I appreciate the plug, Georgianne, because the kind of books that I write, it is very expensive to research.
Yes.
But anyway, I wanted to make sure and thank everybody. But yeah, I do think Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is a book that it's the first. I'll be very honest. It's the first in a series of books that will start looking very directly at issues in ancient and alternative research that will challenge very directly some of the dearly held beliefs of various religions.
Yes.
And I'm not doing so. I must point out to people that I'm not doing so because I'm attempting to slam their religions. I'm not doing so because I'm attempting to make fun of anyone's faith or to make them question it or anything of the sort. That's not my purpose.
I know.
My purpose is rather to get them to think and to show as clearly as I can what some of these issues that are emerging in science and what some of the implications of alternative research is, because pretty much every religion that claims to be founded on some sort of special revelation is implicated in some of these ideas, namely, of course, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity.
Yeah.
Older religions that are of a more philosophical nature, the Vedic religions or the Chinese or Egyptian sorts of philosophical religions, those aren't so much implicated because they're not founded upon or based upon claims to revelation. Their founding is very, very different, and I'm eventually going to be writing a book trying to show how their founding comes directly out of an understanding, at least the ancient understanding of all this physics that we've been talking about. So yes, I have to warn people right up front that Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, if you are squeamish about religious matters, this is not this is not the book for you. It's there are 2 chapters in particular in the book that the first and the third that will raise some very thorny issues, and I hope raise in a manner that will get people genuinely to think and not simply dismiss what I'm saying with parroted answers that have been repeated for so long.
Yes.
But to think deeply about them and reflect deeply about what's going on. But anyway, that's that's enough of my sermon.
Well, these issues need to be thought about deeply, and I hope that in this series that we're going to do, that it will facilitate that.
Well, I do too. The whole problem here is trying to do this in as thorough a manner as possible.
Yeah.
And I have to be honest, Georgianne, this was a very difficult book to write, because to be thorough, I would have really had to have written a book out of each chapter. And I may end up doing that anyway. What I was attempting to do in this book is give people a very, very high overview of what the implications really were. And that's very difficult, because there's so many issues involved. There's so many things to kind of juggle and try and keep in here. You know, when I was writing it, Georgianne, I had the feeling, if people remember going to the circus when they were kids and seeing those people spinning plates on poles, you know, where they would try and spin up, you know, all these plates and keep them all from crashing. Well, that's kind of that's kind of the way I felt when I was writing this book, is one of those plate spinners and trying to keep everything from crashing. And I hope I did, because there's so much material in this book. Basically, it's an examination not only of technologies that could conceivably have faked or staged revelations. All right.
Yeah.
And I connect that to my observation about ancient temples having also been perhaps designed as very primitive sorts of radio transmitters. So, in other words, I explore another aspect of that technology, in that I made the discovery that some of those temples are actually resonant to the theta and alpha brainwave frequencies of the human mind.
Oh.
All right. So, in other words, we're looking at also possibilities here that technologies could have been manipulated precisely to manipulate or engineer religion into existence, and in turn, by means of religion, to socially engineer and manipulate whole populations. So that's one implication. The other implication that I was trying to explore in conjunction with all of this is a comparison of ancient records and statements concerning the genetic engineering of man with actual modern genetic studies, and to see if there were any parallels. I had hoped when I was writing the book to discover enough evidence within modern genetics to suggest that they were looking for evidence of engineering. I was not able to do that. So what I had to do was end up comparing genetic research to the ancient texts to see if there were any areas of possible agreement. And there I was surprised, because there were a few areas of agreement, and there were even some really wild discoveries I made about genetics and some ancient systems of belief, which to me, Georgianne, really corroborated the case that somebody way back when had an awful lot of knowledge of basic principles of genetics.
Yes.
So, you know, there was that discovery. Then I had to deal with the matter of giants and monsters, because, of course, there is lore about giants and monsters from literally all over the world. You know, we don't have to restrict ourselves to the Old Testament. It's certainly in Mesopotamian literature, North American, Native American Indian traditions are full of this stuff,
yes,
as are the Indian traditions of Mesoamerica. And of course, in those traditions, one of the things that I was so stunned and surprised about was that these traditions speak of an actual war with the giants. So it was actually like I was reading versions of Greek mythology.
Yeah.
So, you know, so again, how do we get the Greeks saying one thing, and then way across the Atlantic Ocean we get American Indians saying the exact same thing?
Wow.
So yeah, there's all of this stuff in Gene Strand's Monsters and Men. It's a high overview, Georgianne, of opening up the door, so to speak, to the things that I'm planning to write about in the next series of books. And I want to stress for people that this book is also a book that I intentionally conceived as standing in the series of books that follow the Cosmic War. In other words, they're intentionally conceived as sequels to it, because the real focus of all of this in Gene Strand's Monsters and Men is on the activity of the elite that I believe survived that war.
Yes.
So I also talk a great deal in this book about their activity in constructing monuments all over the world and why they're doing it. So it's a very, very complex book, Georgianne. It's a very, very complex book, and I hope that people will enjoy it.
Well, you mentioned Delitzsch, his dilemma, Babel and Bible.
Yes.
And the out-of-place name for God.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, I think we may have discussed that in another show, but to refresh people's memory, everything is such a blur. I've been on so many radio shows and I'm working so overtime. I don't remember if it was your show or somebody else's show. So if I'm repeating myself here, folks, forgive me. And if I'm not repeating myself, then listen closely. Friedrich Delitzsch was a very, very famous German, obviously, German Assyriologist that lived in the late 19th and on into the early 20th century. And he's quite well known to biblical scholars because, of course, he and Kyle helped author the biblical commentary series that bears their name. It runs to several volumes. But Delitzsch was, of course, also an Assyriologist and an archaeologist, and he was one of the world's back then one of the world's great international scholars of cuneiform languages, everything from Sumerian to Akkadian to Assyrian, all of these languages that used some form of cuneiform. Delitzsch was absolutely one of the premier scholars and linguists of that time. In fact, he even wrote or compiled a lexicon of these languages. So, this man was no fly-by-night.
Right.
Now, he made a discovery when he was in Mesopotamia of some cuneiform tablets. And the discovery, you have to understand, it did not stun him, but it certainly shocked him. Delitzsch was one of these people that was also a higher critic of the Old Testament. In other words, he believed on the basis of philological evidence that the Old Testament text, and particularly the first 5 books of the Bible, were heavily edited from previously existing sources. And he was also very much against the whole Old Testament religion. He had all sorts of moral difficulties believing that this Yahweh character in the Old Testament is really a God of love. In fact, he wrote a very long book in German called The Grand Deception, in which he attacks the whole foundation of Judaism and Christianity on the basis of inconsistencies in the text and inconsistencies, above all, with the morality that he saw in play. Mm-hmm. All right? So, in other words, this gives you kind of the mentality of the man that you're dealing with here. Well, anyway, he makes this cuneiform discovery, and word of it leaks out in Germany. All right? So when Delitzsch gets back to Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm basically issues an invitation, to come to the Imperial Palace at Charlottenburg and basically give a presentation to the Kaiser and his Privy Council, okay? In other words, this is one of those, we're cordially inviting you, but you'd better show up sorts of things. You don't exactly say no to the Kaiser. So Delitzsch, and what's really remarkable, and people have to understand this is like giving a lecture on Assyriological discoveries to President Obama and the National Security Council. Right? That's the level of what we're dealing with here. Yeah, so Delitzsch gives this lecture to the Kaiser and to his court and his ministers, and that's that. And somehow, Georgianne, word of what he said leaks out. All right, and that is a circumstance right there that should give you a little clue that something major is happening here, because word doesn't just leak out of the Kaiser's court unless someone wants it to.
Yes.
All right. Now, I'm not fastening any speculations on who is doing this, because it could have been any number of people, and that's really not the focus of the story.
Yes.
It's what Delitzsch said. What he said, it was the first time that anyone had really pointed out the fact that many of those Old Testament stories had previously existing Mesopotamian bases.
Yes. And
that the biblical text of the stories was therefore a version of the story that had been edited to suit an agenda. All right, Delitzsch over and over implies that this is the case. But then comes the whopper. The whopper is 3 cuneiform texts. I reproduce the pictures of them in the book.
Yes.
And then I reproduce kind of a close-up of the actual cuneiform ideograms, the cuneigrams, that spell out the name Yahweh. All right? Yaha. But the problem, Georgianne, as Delitzsch pointed out, is that these cuneiform tablets on which that name is found date from the time of King Hammurabi.
Yeah.
In other words, they are about 1,000 years older than the earliest possible date for the book of Exodus, where that name is supposedly revealed to Moses and becomes the foundation, part of the foundational claim for the Old Testament religion to have been a specially revealed religion. Do you follow me?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Do you follow the massive implications of what Delitzsch's discovery did?
Oh, yeah.
And why it was announced behind closed doors? And what Delitzsch was really doing, what he was really suggesting, although he doesn't come right out and say this, but you can clearly see that's where he's maneuvering to. What he's suggesting is that the entire foundation of Old Testament religion and any religions based upon it, in other words, not only Judaism, but certainly Christianity is based upon it to a certain degree, and certainly Islam is based upon it to a certain degree. All right? So in other words, by questioning the whole nature of the claim that Moses received a special revelation at the point of the Exodus, and rather pointing out that this name was somehow, for some odd reason, known in ancient times in Mesopotamia long before the Hebrews even arrived on the scene.
Yes.
He's throwing a king-sized monkey wrench into the works. And of course, word of this is, as I mentioned, is leaked out somehow from the Kaiser's court, and it causes an absolute firestorm in Europe and a little bit in this country of controversy, because what it did, Georgianne, it's very important for people to understand this. It not only upset the fundamentalist evangelical confessionally orthodox crowd back then, as you can imagine it would, but it also upset the higher critics who had been busily trying to redate all the books of the Old Testament to thousands of years later than the orthodoxies of the day said that they should be. In other words, you had German and French and British and American higher critics that were saying things like, oh, the book of Exodus had to have been written around 1000 to 800 BC. In other words, hundreds of years after the events that the book of Exodus purports to describe.
Yeah.
So along comes Delitzsch and upsets that apple cart by saying, oh no, the name Yahweh was known was known a long time before that. So in other words, he had everybody that you can imagine, no matter where you stood on the issue of biblical veracity. He had everybody from the fundamentalists to the theological liberals mad at him.
Oh my gosh!
The controversy was so bad that poor Kaiser Wilhelm had to step in his capacity as the chief bishop of the Lutheran churches in Germany and issue a decree basically ordering everybody to shut up.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
It was one of those controversies, Georgianne, that at the time, it was a major controversy, but we hardly know or hear anything about it anymore.
Yeah, yes. Now, why?
Well, the why is because, in all honesty, in my opinion, Georgianne, the why is because they don't want to look squarely in the eye the implications. And please understand, I'm not arguing about the truthfulness or lack thereof of Delitzsch's scholarship, nor of his interpretation of it, nor of his detractors. I'm not concerned with that issue. I'm concerned with the broad philosophical issue.
Yeah.
We don't hear about it because of the massive implications for 3 of the world's major religions that Delitzsch's discovery portends. Because if his conclusions are correct, this means that the claims to be revealed religions of unquestionable truth on the part of those 3 major monotheistic religions are extremely suspect.
Oh, yes.
The one that is least damaged by it is Christianity, and here's why. In the standard versions of Christianity, of course, Christ is the Son of the Old Testament God.
Yeah.
All right? In other words, most standard confessionally Orthodox versions of Christianity, be it Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, or Anglicanism, view the Christian revelation as a continuity and fulfillment of the Old Testament. All right?
Yes.
So in other words, for those versions of Christianity, there is a moral and ethical unity between the Old and New Testaments. The Gnostics, however, pointed out all of the same dilemmas about Yahweh's behavior in the Old Testament that modern people have with the Old Testament. This guy goes around, he treats the Hebrews like you-know-what, and on top of that has them going around and murdering a bunch of other people. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in other words, the Gnostics pointed out not only was this inconsistent with the message of love and peace and redemption that Christ came to preach, they pointed to texts and passages in the New Testament, like in I think it's the 8th chapter of the Gospel of St. John, where Christ says to the Pharisees, "You are of your father the devil, and he was a liar and murderer from the beginning."
Yes.
So in other words, for the Gnostics, there was no identification whatsoever between Christ and the God of the Old Testament. There was an absolute break rather than a continuity. All right?
Yes.
So Christianity, you do get versions of Christianity that wouldn't be so drastically affected by what Delitzsch said. But it's important to recall again that for the mainstream versions of Christianity, yes, they would be. But certainly Delitzsch, his little lecture that was eventually published in a book called Babel und Bibel, or in other words, Babel and the Bible.
Yeah.
Delitzsch raised the ante considerably. And the problem, Georgianne, is that scholars since then have kind of nitpicked their way around this issue. But in my opinion, they really, really haven't addressed the guts or meat of it. And the meat of it really is were these religions specially revealed at all? Do they have some special moral claim that is so certain that it allows us to suspend our normal innate human consciousness and conscientiousness and morality to a God that might order us on pain of disobedience unto death if we should disobey, to go out and murder some people? This is the problem.
Yeah, well, let's ask the audience. If God ordered you to go murder your neighbor, would you do it? I mean,
right. This is the sorts of things that Delitzsch was raising at the turn of the last century. He was writing about these issues. His own studies of Mesopotamian texts and languages and philology and so on had coupled with a philosophical agenda to challenge some of the bedrock foundations of these three religions. Now, I should point out one very interesting thing that I do not mention in the book because I didn't want it to distract people from the main issue into side issues.
Okay.
But the side issues are important because Delitzsch, in rejecting Judaism and Christianity, and of course by implication Islam, as a basis of the religious organization of society, Delitzsch was enough of a scholar, he was enough of a thinker to understand that you had to replace it with something.
Yes.
So what he wanted to replace it with was a return to the old Norse Germanic myths and gods.
Yeah.
Now, that's very significant, Georgianne, because the kind of criticism that Delitzsch was doing was certainly well known to the Nazis. And what did they do? What did they seek to do? Well, within the SS, they replaced Christianity with what? The old Norse myths and gods.
Yes.
So in other words, Delitzsch is part of a cultural trend in Germany that will lead ultimately to the horrors of Nazism. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not fastening the blame for what the Nazis did on poor old Delitzsch. He would have been absolutely appalled.
Yes.
You know, as for that matter, so would the Kaiser. You know, you know, I'm not trying to fasten the blame. I'm just trying to point out that this is a feature of his thinking and of the broader German culture at the time that people need to be aware also exists. All right.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yes, if people stop and think really about the moral implications of what's going on, my word, Georgianne, this Yahweh character would be hauled up in any court in any civilized country in the world for abuse, for murder.
Yes.
You know, look at the story of Abraham. If you were to hear this story in a court of law today, he'd be put away for child abuse.
Oh, yeah.
You know, these people need to start waking up and looking at these stories and looking at them not from the standpoint of parroted answers. This was really what Delitzsch was trying to get at. Not looking at these stories from the sense of parroted answers in order to defend the truthfulness of a religious system.
Yes.
Because when you're doing that, you're placing normal morality ahead, or behind a consideration for an abstract truth of a system.
Yeah.
This is why I keep telling people, get your head out of the book and into your heart.
Yeah. Well, isn't that what Jesus Christ tried to say?
Well,
love.
This exactly is the problem. This is something, you know, and please don't get me wrong here, I'm not trying to promote Gnosticism as a system of belief either, because the Gnostics believed some wild, kooky, crazy, zany things that had their own moral implications, all right? But at least they were willing to point out that there was such a moral disconnect between what they thought Christ was trying to teach and what was going on in the Old Testament. So, these are all issues that people need to face very, very squarely. We could go on, and eventually I'm sure I'll probably get around to writing other things about religion. I'm noticing certain things right now in the book I'm writing that are going to require another book to address. That will deal directly with some topics in religion, and again, it's not going to make a lot of people very happy. But it's better to face these things honestly and put them out there and let people make up their own mind rather than keep going on as we have. So anyway, yes, poor old Delitzsch.
Oh my goodness.
He opened up Pandora's box, George.
He sure did.
Yes, he sure did.
Well, it's like Abraham and Isaac. And that he tied him up on the altar and was going to sacrifice him.
Yes.
Well, in the book of Jasher, it talks about his wife.
Yes.
And that she heard of what he was going to do, and that she died on the way there to try to save her son.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, oh my gosh.
Yeah, the whole thing, Georgianne, is just kind of a people, like I say, what Delitzsch was trying to do was simply wake people up, and really that's all I'm trying to do by mentioning this story that kind of got buried and forgotten in the annals of the history of interpreters of the Bible. It just kind of disappeared. But the fact of the matter is that the story is there, and Delitzsch did do and say these things, and no contemporary account, in my mind, really does full justice to the significance of what he was saying. Again, you have the scholarly attempt to kind of play all this down and direct it into nitpicking at minutia and philology and all of this stuff, and that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about the wider implications.
Well, some people go so far as to say that he was an anti-Semite.
Well, yes, they do, and they're this is the other thing that you have to be very, very careful about. This is the standard scholarly ploy today, and there was in German culture at that time, there was that streak that we saw obviously come out with to a violent end with the Nazis. And there certainly was an element of that in Delitzsch's thinking. But that, to my mind, does not invalidate the larger moral question that he's raising. That's the real problem. Again, there's all sorts of tactics, and that's exactly what I think this one is. If you want to prevent people from asking questions that you don't want asked, then you tar them with the brush of racism, or you tar them with the brush of sexism, or you tar them with the brush of anti-Semitism, what have you. And that immediately shuts down discussion. Well, Delitzsch, when he was talking to the Kaiser, and this is an important point, when you read Babel und Bibel, I defy anyone in that book to find any trace or suggestion of anti-Semitism. It may be present in his other writings, but in that book where he raises that issue, I defy anyone to find it.
Right. Okay. You mentioned the ancient elite, astronomy, finance, and the god of corn versus the god of death. Yes.
Well, this is another thing that I briefly touch on in Gene's Giants, Monsters, and Men, and I touched on it also in Babylon's Banksters. All right.
Yeah.
We seem to be dealing with two philosophies back in ancient times, two general philosophical approaches to religion, to the place of mankind in the the universe. And I call, for want of a better symbolism or iconography, if you will, to highlight what these two philosophies are. I call one the corn god and the other the contract god or the debt god, depending on what's in view. All right?
Yeah.
In one philosophy, you have the idea that the state creates money debt-free. You have the idea that creation is a result of this phenomenal wellspring of love that brings it and calls forth everything into existence. All right?
Mm-hmm.
That is a very, very ancient cosmological view. All right?
Yes.
Then you have, on the other hand, the idea that, and let me go back to the first idea for a moment. You have within that idea of everything arising from a primordial fecundity, all right?
Mm-hmm.
You have also the idea that the principal thing that you seek is communion with or union with that deity, all right?
Yes.
On the other side, you have the god of contract and debt. And in that philosophical ideology, mankind is but a slave and owes a perpetual debt to that contract god, which mankind cannot pay off.
Yeah.
And so you have arising in that system at some point later in history, you have arising the practice of bloody sacrifices and even human sacrifices, because the rationalization for these practices is the payment of a debt. All right. Now, I happen to think there's other processes at work, and we've talked about it in our social engineering series.
Yes.
This idea that what they're really trying to do is shock or traumatize the physical medium through these practices. But in any case, you're dealing with two very different philosophies. Now, I should point out in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I do not get deeply into that question. I do, in the book that I'm writing now,
oh yes, I know.
get deeply I do get deeply into it. And again, people are not going to like the answers. They're not even going to like the comparisons.
Yes, I know.
But the question is there, and you keep prying the lid off these types of questions and issues, and eventually you discover that they keep leading to more and more things that, for want of any better way to put it, that conventional religion would just find absolutely appalling.
Yes.
So we are dealing, in my opinion, Georgianne, to go back to the observations of Delitzsch and to put them into a slightly different context, we are dealing, I think, with essentially, with respect to religion, we are dealing essentially with two very basic worldviews. All right? There is the worldview that is represented by ancient societies like Egypt and Sumer and Vedic India, and of course India is the only society that has maintained this ancient religion to some degree. And then on the other hand, you have the rise of these special revelation religions that go around murdering people.
Yeah.
There's no other way for me to put it other than that. That's what they have done. And they've done so in the name of their system.
Yes.
So that's why I came up with this idea of corn god versus contract god or debt god.
Yes.
And it's very interesting too to see the connection of the economic and financial systems that those two philosophies of God, or philosophies of the divine, if you will, work under and are most comfortable working under, because of course it's in the latter system, the contract or debt god, that you find the practice of banksters issuing monetized debt as money.
Yes.
So, under that system, can you ever pay off the interest on the principal? No, of course not.
No.
You've got the same philosophy at work in your economics as you've got at work in your religion.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
Yes, it is. When you get right down to it and understand the connections and see this stuff actually going on, it's quite eye-opening.
Oh, yes. Well, you talk about technologies or revelations.
Yes.
Mind manipulators.
Yes.
Torsion temples and
yes.
religion revealers. Mind manipulators.
Uh-huh.
What is this alien abduction scenario?
Well, this is the other part that to me is I touch on it very briefly in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, and I'm hoping to touch on it in another book I'm writing right now. I'm writing 3 books right now, Georgianne. Can you believe that? All at the same time, which is why I'm so tired all the time.
Only you could pull that off.
Well, I don't know if I am pulling it off. That's the question. But anyway, the problem that I ran into is if you look at the phenomenon of alien abduction without prejudice to the claims of the stories. All right.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I'm not saying these things are ET, and I'm not saying they're not ET. All right. I'm simply looking at the pattern involved.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
I certainly think that these events are really happening to these people.
Yes.
Okay. The problem is, if you look at the pattern of these stories, they, in many cases, have the same, number one, the same sort of moral disconnect that you see going on in those ancient religious texts. Namely, people are kidnapped, held against their will, horrible things are done to them, and yet they experience this odd sort of love to their abductors.
Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome, exactly. And what do the reason I discuss this is I discuss it in the chapter where I'm talking about Yahweh and his behavior toward the ancient Hebrews, all right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got the same sort of moral disconnect, Stockholm syndrome type of thing going on,
Yeah.
all right? The other thing that is very interesting in many of these abduction cases is you have the implied use of some sort of technology that is being used either to paralyze people or alter their emotional states, all right?
Yes.
And again, if you look at the stories that are taking place in the Old Testament, you have, again, the implied use of a technology being used to cow and terrorize a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
All right? And there's no other way for me to put it other than that, baldly and bluntly.
Yes.
Now, again, I stress the word, the implied use. You can certainly argue that all of this is nonsense, but I want to see philosophical argument as to why it is. I want to see something other than the standard parroted defenses of this activity and behavior that can justify it.
Yes.
Because if it is wrong in the case of alien abductions, if it is wrong in the case of a modern hostage taker who inflicts the Stockholm syndrome on the people he's terrorizing, why is it different in the case of the book of Exodus?
Yeah. And
the only thing that can justify it is, again, some sort of explicit or implicit appeal to the idea that this is a special revelation and this is really God doing this. And again, Delitzsch comes along and blows that out of the water.
Yes.
And, to my mind, morally, what we have being practiced in those books certainly isn't any sort of God I want to believe in or follow.
Yeah.
This is why I raised the whole subject of alien abductions, because alien abduction has created the rise of a new religion, and it's done so almost in exactly the same way. because the people who have suffered this are reproducing, and I feel very sorry for these people because they seem unable to help themselves. They're reproducing the same moral disconnect in their own lives. So, I have to hold open the possibility that we are looking at some very sophisticated mind manipulation technology being applied in conjunction with the application of some very sophisticated techniques of social engineering.
Well, you talk about the beat frequency of the brain.
Yes.
And the beat frequency and out-of-body experiences.
Yes, exactly. You can, a beat frequency, just to explain what that is for people that may not know, if you have two frequencies of electromagnetic energy that interfere with each other, that interference pattern is going to set up a beat, quite literally, a kind of a staccato beat or rhythm. And the brain will entrain itself, if those frequencies are in the right resonance, will entrain itself to that beat frequency. And that beat frequency, in turn, introduces an emotional state so that you can actually induce the idea that you can have an out-of-body experience with very, very simple technological means. This is my point.
Brain entrainment is a topic that the government would rather nobody speak
Well, of course
about.
not. Of course not. Because this whole idea that you can manipulate emotional states, that you can manipulate not only out-of-the-body experiences, but you can manipulate feelings associated with those. You can manipulate feelings of faith. You can manipulate feelings of adoration or reverence. You can manipulate people hearing voices in their heads as if they're actually real. And, of course, once you admit the possibilities of all of this and couple it to the idea that, hey, there really was a very ancient, very sophisticated civilization that knew all this stuff, where does that put religion?
Yeah.
Where does it put religion?
Look at the Middle East.
Yes, exactly.
Everybody's screaming for freedom.
Yeah. People, if I were living under Islam, let's understand what Islam is. It is basically an unreformed, unreconstructed Old Testament religion. If I were living under that system, and if any other human being were living under that system for so long, wouldn't you get kind of tired of it?
Yeah.
This idea that you owe this murdering Islamic version of Yahweh absolute obedience to go out and murder other people?
Well,
for your 72 virgins in the sky?
Yes.
Wouldn't you get tired of living under that system? Wouldn't you get tired of living under the dictators that the West has foisted on you?
Oh, yes.
Wouldn't you get tired? Of course you would.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
And to think, these idiots, they say, well, it's all about oil. Stupid. I just get infuriated at that. This is a younger generation, and they want to be free.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to think that most of this is genuine grassroots. Just we're fed up and we're mad as hell and we're not taking it anymore.
Yeah,
sort of thing.
Yeah.
I have to agree with you, and this is I think where many people are with respect to traditional religion. Because those religions have, as we've discussed before, innate, built-in defense mechanisms. They're kind of pre-programmed so that people will not start asking or attempting to answer these questions for themselves.
Yes.
So I think you've got a great class of the spiritually disenfranchised out there.
Oh, yes.
Who are going to church on Sunday and they're listening to these preachers try to uphold a system whose moral implications are truly, truly, if you stop and think about it, awesome and, in a certain sense, diabolical.
Oh, yes, very.
And you have people sitting in the pew entertaining these types of questions and possibly maybe raising their hand every now and then and asking a question and being told politely to shut up and don't talk about that anymore, or being given some sort of theological tap dance. And they go home and they keep these questions to themselves. I think there's a lot of these people out there.
Yes.
And they're just getting fed up with the same old answers.
Oh, yeah.
Because the same old answers aren't really addressing the real gut issue. You can sit there and talk about philology and this word in ancient Sumerian and that word in ancient Hebrew and Akkadian, and what you're doing when you do that is tap dancing around the questions these people are asking.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you also talk about electromagnetic alteration of DNA.
Yes, I do.
How is that carried out?
Well, again, it's part of these templates. It's a natural consequence. They discovered when they were playing with these mind-altering technologies and even doing radar experiments, Georgianne, that prolonged exposure to electromagnetic energy in the microwave and radar frequency range will gradually begin to alter human DNA itself. It sort of tears it apart. All right. So in other words, once you conclude that, once you have understood that, then you understand why all of a sudden they started investigating that type of technology for the direct manipulation of human DNA by electromagnetic means.
Yes.
So, in other words, all of this stuff is going on now, and you can bet your bottom dollar that if we know about it now, that very high ancient civilization that I talk about in the Cosmic War knew it back then.
Oh, yes.
And here's the rub. If any of that, here's the philosophical problem, Georgianne. This is why I'm writing these series of books dealing with what I think are the post-Cosmic War activities of the surviving elites. Because if any of that technology survived, and stop and think about what I've just said, in any war, no matter how destructive, does it truly and literally destroy everything? No. So if any of that technology survived in the hands of those surviving elites, would they have used it to further their goals and to reconstruct, to begin the process of reconstructing civilization? You bet they would.
Oh, yes.
In a heartbeat, they would.
Yes.
They would have tried to maintain it in operating order as long as possible, and in the meantime, put into place as quickly as they could alternative technologies that could, to some degree, do the same thing.
Oh.
That's where I think, and why I think, you have ancient temples that are also very carefully constructed as very primitive radio transmitters, and, as I show in Gene Science Monsters and Men, as very primitive mind manipulation machines. And if they're willing to do that in the name of religion, they're willing to stage revelations too.
Oh, sure. Sure. Well, going back and touching on the Iraq War, number one, when they had hundreds of Iraqi soldiers just walk out, throw down their guns, and throw up their arms.
Yes.
And say, God told us to.
Yes.
Yeah, Allah told us to.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know. The whole thing is suspicious as all get out.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Well, if it's in the genes, then what is it? What is it, Joseph?
Well, that's the title of one of the chapters in the book. And my problem is I think, and again, I go back to what I said when I began the show.
Mm-hmm.
I started out Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men with one of my goals being to at least argue a sufficient prima facie case to suggest that one of the purposes of the Genome Project was that they were looking either to confirm or to deny the ancient texts that suggested that humanity was genetically engineered into existence by some sort of genetic cousin that came here, all right, and tinkered with the sort of proto-humans he found here, all right?
Yeah.
I was not able, to my satisfaction, to find enough evidence to suggest that. All right? What I did find were some very peculiar, very vague sorts of corroborations of some of these ancient myths. So in other words, we don't know what's in the genes. That's why I left that a question mark. If there is anything in the genes of human DNA that they have discovered or are in the process of investigating for that express purpose, they're not talking about it. There's suggestive little things. The way I like to tell people to picture this is imagine a picture hanging on the wall. And in the middle of the picture, there's a big black hole. But you can see the outlines. It's a picture of something or someone. There's enough of the picture left that you can see the outlines, that it's a picture, all right?
Yes.
And it makes sense, except you can't tell who or what it is because of that big black hole right in the center of it. That's exactly the way that anyone looking at the genetic evidence or lack thereof of what they're up to with respect to the history of the human race with genetic sequencing, that's exactly the way it looks and feels. Mm-hmm. It looks and feels to me as if they're deliberately not talking about something, but they're giving you enough clues that you can see the outline of the whole. You follow me?
Yes.
Now, I did come up with some very interesting clues that somebody knows something, both in ancient times and modern times.
Yes.
And I'm not going to even get into the specifics of it until people have had time to read the book, but I'll just mention one thing to look for in Genes, Giants, Monsters, Men, and that is the connection between modern genetics and the ancient Chinese system of divination called the I Ching. Ho-ho! 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 Now, Georgianne, I'll tell you this much. The parallels between the I Ching and modern genetics, and specifically the human genome, are absolutely beyond any chance of statistical coincidence. Somebody way back when knew something and came up with the I Ching, but here's the rub. Why did they use that genetic knowledge to come up with a system of divination?
Yeah.
You're looking at another broken off piece, in my opinion, of all of that ancient science that really has not been properly understood until the late 20th century with the rise precisely of genetics.
Well, Craig, you mentioned Craig Ventnor.
Yes.
He has touted the fact that he has made synthetic chromosomes.
Yes.
And synthetic DNA.
Yes.
My goodness, Joseph.
It's certainly possible, and this is an important point to understand, and people need to listen. People need to put on their thinking caps real strong right now. The American patent law says that in order for there to be a patentable object, it must fulfill 4 requirements. Number 1, it cannot have arisen in nature by itself.
Yes.
Number 2, it must be the work of, quote, the hand of man. Number 3, it must be clear, that is to say, anyone else following the described technique should be able to do it. Okay?
Yeah.
And number 4, it must perform some specific use or function. Now, if you stop and apply those 4 criteria, Georgianne, to the ancient stories from Mesopotamia and elsewhere, that mankind was engineered into existence by some sort of genetic cousin,
yes,
then under those criteria, we are patentable objects and property.
Oh.
So we're right back to the corn god, debt god scheme.
Oh my gosh, Joseph.
You see what I'm getting at here?
Yes.
And I raise that issue in Genius, Giants, Monsters, Men, specifically in the context of Craig Ventnor and his private race to crack the genome code. All right. So in other words, this has huge implications. This is why I wrote the book. People need to understand. This has huge implications, not only for modern times, but if any portion of the ancient stories are true, and those cousins show back up,
oh yes,
what are we going to do?
Oh, good question.
What are we going to do?
Good question.
Yeah, this is a huge story.
Well, the ancient cousins could be, may have been referred to as angels. Oh my.
Well, they could have, but again, let's get away from this idea of ascribing a kind of primacy to the biblical text.
Okay.
We need to understand that it is, in my opinion, one text of many texts out there,
yes,
that basically are recording fragments of the same story. But to ascribe it a kind of a primacy to our thinking is again to fall victim to the idea that, okay, all of this originates and has some special privileged status by dint of the fact, and it can only have that status by dint of the fact that it is based or founded upon a claim to special revelation.
Yeah.
Once you have jettisoned that presupposition about that text, then it's no different than any other text.
Yeah.
It has no special moral sanction. It has no special philosophical sanction. Its value is to, precisely in the sense as to be compared to other texts telling a similar story.
Yeah.
So, we can call them anything. Angels, we can call them jinns as the Muslims do. We can call them all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But, genetically, and in terms of these stories, what we're dealing with are not the standard visions of angels that people have as these disembodied spirits, but we are dealing with something else, I think. We could be dealing with angels in the classical sense, because in most of those doctrines, angels can take physical form.
Yes.
And if they can take physical form, conceivably, they could tinker with whatever proto-humanity was here, and perhaps even interbreed with, interbreed with humanity.
Well, they have.
So yeah,
to be...
I'm not trying to rule all that out of the picture.
Yeah.
I'm just saying we need to be careful as to where we go.
Yeah. Well, some of them at least had to be genetically compatible with the human female.
There had to be enough compatibility there, or there, at least as far as our contemporary knowledge of genetic science is concerned.
Yeah.
But again, we have to take into account the possibility that their understanding of it was much more advanced, and in my opinion it probably was. So they may have been able to do things that currently we are not able to do. So, there's all sorts of speculative possibilities and what-ifs and ands and so on. But to me, again, I try and avoid detailed scenarios. My emphasis in the book is on the big picture.
Yes.
And the big picture, is if you take those stories seriously, and if they happened, and then apply most modern standards of jurisprudence to them, then it raises a really interesting picture, namely, humanity is a patentable, propertied object to somebody. So couple that, think of that, and remember in the back of your mind that there have been these gods from Mesoamerica to Mesopotamia wanting sacrifice.
Yes. Oh.
And service.
Well.
And worship.
Yes.
And who does that sound like?
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah. My goodness.
Yep, my goodness is right.
There is a lot in here.
Yep.
Everybody, you're going to want a copy of this book. It is just loaded with interesting material. My goodness, Joseph.
It's a real. I don't know how to put it. It is a real different book. It is. I hope readers understand. It's not a lighthearted book.
Yeah.
Parts of it will be shocking to many people, I think. But I can assure you that I'm merely prying the lid off the box in this book. I fully intend to explore some of the topics that it raises in much more depth in future books. So, this book is also, in a certain sense, a kind of a warning.
Yes.
That if you can't stomach or can't handle thinking about these things, stop here, read no further.
Yeah. The lid needs to be pried off.
Oh, I agree.
It needs to be. My goodness. We've gone around and around and around and around for thousands of years with the same old stuff.
Yep.
And
that's right.
Today we have so much technology at our disposal, and we can do research. We can piece together these things.
Right.
My goodness, Joseph, and you have done a splendid job.
Well, thank you. I'm trying, and it's important again for people to understand what I am doing and arguing is high speculation.
Yes.
It's very important for people to remember this. This is my personal opinion and my thoughts. It's up to the readers to fit them in if they accept any portion of them, or to reject what portions, or all of it. It's up to the reader to make of all of this what they will.
Yeah.
But again, it is to be stressed that it may be argued speculation. I do try and argue what I think. I do try and make the case, or at least make it solid enough that it can't simply be ignored.
Yes.
But it's up to individuals to decide whether that's been done. I'm not promoting a new religion to replace an old one.
Yes.
Religion. I'm about as far from promoting any system or imposing any system of thinking or thought or belief on anyone else as I can be.
Yes.
the whole thrust of that series of books has been recently to show that is precisely the problem.
Yeah.
Or at least one of the problems. So,
well, how many times have I said that I believe that Jesus Christ came to set us free from religion?
Religion, yes, I agree.
Oh, my goodness.
I agree with that. I just can't. I can't see any other real consequence to things other than that anymore. I have people on my website, Georgianne, and one person in particular that just drives me nuts, and basically everybody else too, because she's one of these self-appointed defenders of the faith.
Oh dear.
And everything has to be defending that system.
Yeah.
And ignoring or not even really discussing things with people or understanding that, she might not know as much as the very people. And in one case, I know this for a fact because she's trying to do theology with a mutual friend of ours.
Oh, dear.
Okay. You know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
So,
heaven. Oh, dear. Heaven forbid.
Yes, and I'm just, people, if you want to talk and defend your religion, there are plenty of sites to do that on.
Yes.
Get a clue about, Georgianne, they have no sense of even the propriety of when it's socially acceptable to talk or not to talk about these things. They talk about it all the time.
Oh, my goodness.
And, it just drives me nuts, Georgianne. It just absolutely drives me nuts.
Yeah. Well, I will say this, Joseph. You are highly schooled, highly learned. You're a very learned man. And for people to come up against you with this falderall stuff that they're taught in Sunday school.
Oh, it's yeah. Well, thank you, Georgianne. Yeah, you can imagine what it's like.
Yes.
America is one of the most theologically illiterate countries in the world.
Oh yes, it is.
And that's why this nutty American civil religion, evangelical, pre-tribulational rapture nonsense is able to flourish in this country, but not so much in other places where there's a much more direct link to really historical Christianity.
Yeah.
America is so rife with just all sorts of religious nuttiness. And it's because the American people, our school system won't let you talk about theology, so you never really learn the importance of that discipline culturally and how it affected and influenced at levels that people can scarcely imagine.
Yes.
But, every time I talk about theology, everyone takes that as license to comment on this and that and to become defenders of the faith and beat everybody over the head with Orthodox dogmatics or Roman Catholic dogmatics or so on and so forth. And my sole point in raising these issues is merely historical and sociological. I am not defending churchianity, of any sort, shape, stretch, variety, or what have you. That's not my intention or purpose, and the people that think it is are just, I'll come right out and say here on this interview, are just sadly and sorely mistaken.
Yes. Oh, Joseph.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I feel when I read these things, Georgianne. Is Joseph.
Oh my gosh!
It's one of those. Mommy, make them stop moments.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, to change gears a little bit, Richard Hoagland did a program on Red Ice.
Yes.
About this disconnected society.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh well, it's not even off the topic. What Richard Hoagland was talking about is a mutual friend of ours in the field of alternative research, a very well-known and, in my opinion, just a superb researcher, a fellow by the name of Richard Dolan. All right, and he would be a good one to have on your show, as a matter of fact, because he is one of the, to give the listeners an idea of who he is, he's one of ufology's best-known researchers. And he's an Oxford graduate like myself, all right?
Yes.
And a trained historian. So in other words, he approaches the subject of ufology from the standpoint of a documents researcher. He goes and digs up government documents and sits down and analyzes them and tries to understand what they mean for the philosophical issue of extraterrestrials and all of that. All right. So he's a fascinating man, and he's one of the few. Personally, he's one of the few ufologists I have any use for, because unlike other big names in that field, he does not get carried away with making his views almost a religion to the point that he is no longer able to think critically or clearly about things that some of the other big names should know better. You know, I'm really having to bite my tongue because I want to mention who those other names are. But Dolan, I have a great deal of respect for. Now, he wrote 2 books called UFOs and the National Security State. They're a 2-volume study of how the subject of UFOs is intimately and deeply related to the creation of this kind of fascist quasi-police state culture that we live in now. All right? He thinks and argues, in my opinion, the strongest case that UFOs are kind of the secret, hidden, driving force behind the creation of the society that we live in now.
You mean the police state?
The police state, right.
Yeah.
Now, in the second of those books, the second volume of those books, and I have a paper in my members-only area on my website that addresses Dolan's idea here very directly and specifically. But briefly, he has the idea that when the post-war period began, and the American military-industrial complex basically arose and became a permanent feature and fixture not only of the American government, but of the American economy. Remember what President Eisenhower said when he left office, that this was something new in the American experience. Prior to that, we had not had this immense, huge, permanent military, large military and permanent armaments industry.
Yes.
And Dolan picks up on this and goes one step further and argues that with the subject of UFOs, we created a huge black projects research empire. And we did. Everybody knows this. But what Dolan is arguing is that because of the amount of time and money spent on these projects, what you in effect had was the creation of a breakaway civilization that was using its technology and its extreme advance over what was publicly known, and using its bottomless source of funding to basically become a separate civilization unto itself, to the point that it may have actually established actual centers of its civilization off this planet. Okay? Now, Dolan, in other words, is saying the same exact thing as Richard Hoagland has been saying with the idea that there's a secret space program and a public one.
Yes, I believe that.
Yeah, and he's saying exactly the same thing as I've been saying, that at the end of World War II, the Nazis weren't defeated. They simply went underground and continued their projects, not only by themselves, but also, you recall, I've been saying, that they continued it in a variety of host countries
Yes.
inside their black projects, including this one.
Yes.
All right? So in other words, Dolan is saying almost the same thing. But now, this is where my view is a little bit distinct from either Richard Hoagland's or Richard Dolan's. In that if you look at what I've been arguing since the Cosmic War came out, which was, 2006 I think it was, the post-Cosmic War elites, to my mind, constitute the historical foundation for that breakaway civilization. In other words, what I'm saying is you're looking at something that is millennia old, and that they have been trying to get back to where they were technologically, and perhaps even in terms of location itself, before that war happened. So in other words, you're looking, that's why I have this whole series of books I'm writing now about the activities of the post-Cosmic War elites. Because what they're, the very moment that you say that this activity of creating systems of measures and weights after, that Cosmic War, and dispersing that system of weights and measures around the world, well, what do you need to do that for?
Yeah.
Well, you would need to do it if you're going to establish any reliable basis of commerce.
Yes.
So in other words, if you look behind the activity of the measures involved in some of these Neolithic sites that are, 15 to 20,000 years old, and they're all employing the same system of measure, you have to ask yourself, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because if you're going to have any sort of global civilization again, you have to have reliable weights and measures to carry on and conduct commerce.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. Yes.
You see? So, and again, I get into that in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. If you're going, if you've just suffered a devastating war and you're trying to get back to where you were quickly, what do? You create a race of what? Slaves.
Yeah.
And that's what the stories say they did.
Oh, my gosh.
How do you keep these slaves who you've given too much intelligence in line? You create religion.
Yes. Oh.
Sacrifice a few of them,
Oh.
You see what's going on. So in other words, I'm approaching things with the speculation, and again, it's speculation. A model that says, okay, this breakaway civilization has been around for a long, long time.
Yes.
I mean, if we get right down to it, Georgianne, what was Nazi Germany?
It was a breakaway.
It was precisely. What have I said all along? In fact, I think I said it first here on your show. Nazi Germany was the first modern, sophisticated world power.
Yes.
That deliberately and consciously was trying to reconstruct Atlantis.
Yes.
And all the technology. In other words, the agenda that Nazism was following was straight out of the occult secret societies in that country between the wars. That agenda, that ideology, took power in the form of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. And at the end of the war, that whole party, that whole ideology went right back underground.
Oh, yes, it's never died.
It's never died. You don't have to look too far or too long to see that.
Well, my gosh.
The only thing that's changed is it's not tied to the fate of Germany anymore. It's internationalized itself.
Yeah, well, my goodness, we set up the Nazi CIA.
Yeah, well, exactly. We made that bargain with the Nazis, with the CIA and all sorts of other stuff. So, yeah, it basically became an organization with international extent and penetration. That's the problem.
Yes.
So in a certain sense, Nazism after the war was much more powerful than it had ever been prior to or during the war.
Oh my gosh.
So, there's a scary thought. But you're dealing with a breakaway civilization. So in other words, I think, there's three versions of this idea out there. Richard Hoagland's, Richard Dolan's, and mine. And I think we're all agreed, and I think we would all agree to the idea that, there are many possible breakaway civilizations. I mean, if we can imagine the American Black Project apparatus becoming sort of an entity unto itself, then we can imagine the same thing of the Russian Black Project's apparatus, of the Chinese Black Project's apparatus, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
In other words, you might be looking not at just at one breakaway civilization, but you might be looking at several. And whether or not they're in contact with each other, that's another matter.
Yeah.
They probably are, but to what degree do they cooperate? To what degree do they make common cause? That's another problem.
Yeah.
So you see, it is, to my mind, extremely likely. But now there's one final point that we need to address when we talk about this. And again, you have to look to what I've said in my writings, particularly in Babylon's Banksters, because I'm trying to address in that book this particular issue, and incidentally in Nazi International, to address this issue very directly. If you have a breakaway civilization, let's stop and consider what a civilization is.
Yes.
A civilization has an ethos. It has a culture.
Yeah.
It has subtle little things that, an American or Canadian will do or think that will be different than a Frenchman may do or think, or that a Pole may do or think, all right?
Yeah.
So it's that which I mean by culture. And, of course, our Western culture is going to have certain things or mores that it does or thinks that are going to be different than Chinese culture, and so on and so forth. So you get what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So a breakaway civilization's got to have an ethos. It's got to have a culture. It's got to have a broad ideology, in other words, that it's following. It even has to have a certain kind of, it may have a certain kind of religion, all right? Mm-hmm. Or understood common accepted philosophical principles is what I'm getting at.
Yes.
The other thing a civilization needs is it needs government. Mm-hmm. It needs a bureaucratic structure in order to function efficiently and smoothly.
Yes.
All right? And I say bureaucratic structure because of a very important thing. Modern states are known for bureaucracies. In other words, if you go back to medieval times, government came to a standstill when the king died. Mm-hmm. But then they discovered bureaucracies can function in the name of kings and do so on a permanent basis with no hiccup or stopping until we get a new leader. In other words, when I say that these parallel or breakaway civilizations have to have government, what I'm emphasizing is they have to have bureaucracy.
Yes.
All right? And they certainly do. Okay?
Yeah.
The third thing is, if they're going to be a genuine breakaway civilization, here comes the whopper. If they're really governments, then they have to have, number one, sources of funding. They have to have an economy.
Oh.
Now, I mention that, I stress that, because remember something that I said back when the bailout occurred. Mm-hmm. That the banksters were acting as if someone was holding the gun to their heads and they were being blackmailed because they were insisting that they wanted no oversight of where this money was going to go.
Well, there's trillions that nobody knows where it went.
Well, I'm saying that, in my opinion, it's very likely that that money was sucked up by the economy or economies of these breakaway civilizations.
Well, what would they do with money, George?
I leave it for you to think.
Oh.
How are you going to... Georgianne, let's remember, one stealth bomber costs over $1 billion.
Yes.
Now, that's the stuff we know about.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay? I can assure you that if you're dealing with projects that have been underway since the end of World War II for 60 years, stop and imagine the amount of money required to make these toys work.
Oh.
So in other words, to me, what the breakaway civilization does is it perfectly rationalizes the reason why you have intelligence agencies, criminal syndicates, and the drug trade all so tightly interwoven together.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay.
Because these projects literally need massive amounts of money. And they need somehow, some way to keep that money out of the public economy and off the books.
Yeah.
That's why you have so many bank failures for so many years. I mean, the latest was not the first.
Wow.
Go back and think of BCCI. In fact, I've got a blog coming up about that. Go back and think of Nugon Hand. Go back and think of the savings and loan scandal. Franklin Bank, Penn Square, all of the banks. Think of all of the banks that in the last 30 years have failed and the billions of dollars that have been looted. Where has it gone? My conclusion, tentatively, my speculation, is that it disappeared into these breakaway civilizations and into their essentially parallel economies. And if it's a genuinely breakaway civilization, this means the economies that they support are quite literally almost completely detached from the public when we see. So we're not only dealing, Georgianne, with a public versus a secret physics, we're dealing with a public versus a secret economy. You follow me?
Yes.
So, in other words, you need not only an economy, but you also need some other things that governments do. If it's going to be a genuinely breakaway civilization, what do governments do? Well, they conduct diplomacy with each other.
Yeah.
So you've got to have a breakaway civilization equivalent of a foreign ministry with diplomats and liaisons and so on to other governments. So, in other words, I'm positing that there has to be a liaison not only between that breakaway civilization and the United States government, but any other government and any other breakaway civilizations.
Well, I can't imagine one of these breakaway governments, civilizations, coming into the White House and talking to Obama. I just can't imagine that.
Well,
I mean, I think the reasons are obvious.
Well, I can't imagine they would be talking to any president.
Yeah.
But there has to be a liaison between some level of the American government and the breakaway civilization. In other words, once you posit the idea of a breakaway civilization and really sit down and analyze what the term civilization really means, then you have to assume that all the trappings that you see publicly are going to be there secretly and privately. All right? That's what it really means. So, you've got economies, you've got, and the reason I'm stressing the banks here again and the bank failures that have been connected with the CIA is because precisely what those are telling you is that these were banks for a breakaway civilization. They were the conduit between the public and the secret civilization. They were a link, a gateway between the two.
Oh my gosh.
You see, this is what people are missing in this story.
Oh. That is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it is. Oh. When you stop and put all these pieces together.
Yes.
Richard Dolan's insights, Richard Hoagland's insights, my idea that you had a breakaway civilization around for a long time, that the Nazis were part of it, yada, yada, yada. When you put all that together, and then start looking at the big, huge picture that it's painting, that's what you're dealing with.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow.
So in other words, what I'm saying is, it's not just the CIA that you're looking at here.
Yeah.
The CIA is just like any other government agency. It's a front, and it's been infiltrated and being used by these people that are part of this breakaway civilization. But when you're looking at all these big bank failures and their connections to intelligence agencies, that's what you're looking at. You are looking at, in my opinion, the footprints of that breakaway civilization.
Wow. That's awesome, Joseph.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Well, with money, they can just enter digits on a computer.
Yes.
And voila, you have a few $1 trillion.
Yes, exactly.
They're just digits.
Yeah.
My gosh. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Joseph. Awesome. Awesome. Well, everybody, go to Giza, Giza, deathstar.com. There is a PayPal button there. Please make use of it. And you can email Joseph at vardes3@aol.com. Vardes is V is in Victor, A-R, D is in David, A-S, the number 3 at AOL.com. And my goodness, Joseph, you have outdone yourself.
Well, thank you, Georgianne, and please, everybody, help Georgianne out with some donations too, because this show's very expensive, and she's not getting, I know for a fact, near the support that she needs to keep it going. So please, if you enjoy the show and you want to keep hearing it, step up to the plate.
Thank you,
and I want to remind people that they can get my books off my web store now from my website too. So, and I do want to thank everybody for the memberships on the website, for the donations, and especially to that dear lady, but to everybody, thank you.
Well, and a huge thank you to you, Joseph, for your research, for your writings, for this interview, for everything. This is very special.
Oh, thank you.
And you're welcome. It's Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. And this is our first in a series, and it is the 9th of April, Saturday. And just God bless everybody that's listening. Good night.
Good night.